That was Fruits of Labour by Party Dozen. This is now Media Mothership here on Edge Radio 99.3 FM, broadcasting out of Nipaluna, Hobart, Tasmania. On this show, we're exploring how media can shape our understanding of the world around us. And I'm your host, Dr. Craig, PhD. I'm going to pull out the titles because I'm with esteemed company today. So I'm Dr. Craig, PhD. I'm joined by Associate Professor Adjunct, probably be Adjunct Associate Professor Max Travers in Sociology at University of Tasmania. Hello, Max.
Hi, rare appearance on Edge Radio.
That's weird. Is this your first appearance?
It is my first appearance. I think it's great.
So far, so good. The seconds that have ticked by have been pretty quality radio, I feel, so far. Thank you, Max. And I'm also joined by Michael Sweet, PhD candidate. You're studying in law, researching alcohol control in the Northern Territory. How's that going, Alcohol Control in the Northern Territory Research Project? You're midway through at the moment.
How's the alcohol control going? Like
I
what we're hearing out of Alice Springs at the moment, or how's my project going?
I know.
Two great questions.
I realized when I asked it, it's like, I don't want Michael to necessarily be on the spot to make sweeping political generalizations about alcohol control. So how's the project going, firstly?
For me, slowly. I'm a guy who likes to understand everything. And of course, in this world, it's not easy to understand everything. So it's a bit of a deep dive. That's what I've been doing until my supervisors pulled me out struggling from the rabbit hole and went, no, you actually have to write a PhD.
Yes, as opposed to a massive amount of data sets that you can lose yourself in.
Oh, I went deeply philosophical. What's the law for? What's its purpose? What's politics for? What's the economy for? And what's the purpose of morality?
Which is why I've invited you in today to ask these hard-hitting questions of a film both of us, all three of us, saw 2 weeks ago now, Prey. But before we get to that, actually, Max, you mentioned what you've currently been researching. So
My last project was about a study for the government about retirement villages. And you can, if you're interested in reading it, it's a sociology study. And it's on the Ahuri website, AHURI, and you can read the whole thing there. That's one of the advantages of working for the government, is at least you get your work promoted through a reliable internet site.
So it's
There are many disadvantages, I should add, in working for the government as well.
I'd love you to blow the lid on that in a future episode.
Yes, but no, I enjoyed it. I think it's good. It's the only study I've ever done about old age. And as a newly retired person, I thought there was a certain symmetry or satisfaction in doing a study about retired people. And it allows you to get a rapport, what they call in sociology, rapport, R-A-P-P-O-R-T, when you are interviewing people who have similar life experiences.
So you felt in some way, not a coming-of-age research project, like maybe a coming of age into retirement age.
It achieves, if you're a young person studying young people, as a lot of sociologists and I myself have done in the past, or if you're an older person studying older people, you achieve a sort of realism or a verisimilitude kind of idea, and that's very relevant to the Prey film we're going to look at, whether there is that there or not.
Yes.
I mean, but that's what we're aiming for. We're actually aiming to honestly reproduce different viewpoints within these organisations. Not just the older people living there, but the managers who are running the place as well. So you have to kind of think of the way in which you can gain empathy for their position as much as the people who may be being ill-treated.
Because in terms of media's representation of retirement villages, there's been a lot of news coverage recently of it. Well, there haven't been many movies.
It's a little bit misleading. A retirement home, a residential home, is where you go when you are very old and sick and are treated very badly because they're cutting all these services. But a retirement village is quite different. It's something where you go when you're well, when you are younger, when you are living independently in your own home, just as you would do if you weren't in a village at all. And a lot of people, more and more people, are choosing to use their money after retirement to go and live in these places. And then there are all kinds of issues within them. So it's about retirement villages, not retirement residential homes. So that's the first thing
Right.
you have to explain.
Yeah, I'm learning a lot. We could set aside the whole half hour to this very point,
We
but
could.
we
It's not that we're
could.
trying to waste time because we don't have much to say or it's too difficult to say about
You're
the film
spoiling
Prey.
the surprise of our lack of content.
Let me just say to begin with, Prey, fantastic film. Fantastic science fiction film.
How many stars out of 10?
It's an 8.
Oh.
It's definitely the best I've seen in the the Predator series, other than the first one. And it's high praise. And
I feel we're being very postmodern
it
here.
raises all kinds of ideas which we've been
Yeah.
talking about. We've tried to connect it to different academic literatures. There are ideas and arguments we don't really fully understand. We don't have the evidence, but we're going to kind of give you a flavour of what we're in, what kind of issues it raises for us. And you can watch it at home as well. It's on Disney Plus, I believe.
That's right. Yeah, it's on a streaming network. Michael, do you want to go postmodern and tell us what you give this out of 10 in this kind of, we'll get the popularist narrative out of the way.
I'd give it a good 6.
Well, yeah, it's not a fail. It's a
No.
strong pass grade at the university level. I mean, 60
It's
out
a
of 100.
fantastic film.
Yeah, it
Fantastic.
passes. Michael passed it.
Got to leave room for improvement. That's what I reckon.
That's a good comment for the director. I put that comment on many student essays. You've got to leave room for your future work. I want to give you something to struggle against, so you have a kind of boon of knowledge. Anyway, I'm going to do the plot now of Prey. So Prey came out last year, 2022. Look, I feel this film has two halves. The first half is a coming-of-age drama, and this is just broadly speaking at this point. So coming-of-age drama where we have our female protagonist, young Comanche woman who's trying to defy, societal views of what she should and shouldn't do, right? In the first half, right? She's very much set up as wanting to become a brave, a hunter. And then the movie shifts into a completely, well, not complete, but a different film about action, science fiction, horror, I argue, in the second half. So broadly, the film's set in the Comanche Nation 300 years ago. So the date they have at the opening credit sequence is 1719, and it's in the Great Plains of North America. So it's a story of this young woman, Naru, who is, and again I'm quoting here from the Rotten Tomatoes plot summary, she's a fierce and highly skilled warrior. When danger threatens her camp, she sets out to protect her people. The prey she stalks and ultimately confronts turns out to be a highly evolved alien predator with a technologically advanced arsenal, resulting in a vicious and terrifying showdown between the two adversaries. I quickly want to point out that plot description misses what I think are another protagonist, which is, and again, another review wrote it as the good, the bad, and the evil. You have the good, the Comanche hunter, and I guess broadly, possibly that society. The bad, the predator, who's just there to kind of hunt for glory, possibly. Whereas, the good guys, the Comanche Nation, are there to hunt for sustainability. And then we have the evil, these French trappers, which we see about halfway through the film, who are there to hunt for, greed, for money. So yes, the main character wants to basically prove themselves in the start of the film, this coming-of-age narrative.
Just to interrupt, Craig.
Yeah.
You've made the first anachronism here when you describe her as a skillful hunter. Whereas in reality, would she have been a skillful hunter in the first place, or been allowed to be?
Well, let's define our terms first.
We
So
have to suspend
anachronism.
disbelief from the beginning.
How do we define anachronism?
It's a way of talking about the past, where you were bringing elements from the present, and the two time periods jar in some way. So,
for example, there should be a hunter-gatherer society in 1719, Comanche Nation. However, you're pointing out that there are some anachronistic character struggles, right?
I'd say, first of all, the fact that she was a skilled hunter to begin with is an anachronism, because she wouldn't have been allowed to hunt in the actual society. Not that we know all three of us very much about that, but that's what we would say.
All right, so that's a good
the other
point.
thing is that the feminist narrative which you've set up is an anachronism.
In terms of would feminism have existed in 1719 Comanche
that society.
culture? Because what we're saying here is that the dialogue and the motivations of this character seem to be informed by modern sensibilities of a la a kind of maybe a feminist trajectory that she's embarking upon.
It's the kind of story, I think we discussed this before, which is a bit like, to use a rather trite example, in the football films of our present times, Bend It Like Beckham, the woman who joins the football team and is allowed to participate to a certain extent and then shows everyone else that she's as good as everybody else. That kind of narrative, could that narrative have existed, trope, I think you would use the word,
Yes.
in early 17th century America, in these American Indian communities?
Well, Michael,
I mean, even calling them communities is an interesting thing.
Yes. Well, what I mean, I know your research project is not on hunter-gatherer societies as represented by Western narratives in cinema, but it does touch upon narratives and portrayals of indigenous communities.
In terms of my research, I'm a sociologist, and the big thing at the moment in theory is post-colonial theory and the discovery of the importance of the indigenous perspective. So we're getting very kind of positive views of indigenous ways of life and the implication that we should be more like that. So this film kind of feeds in very much into that.
That current discourse of portraying sympathetic, positive representations of indigenous cultures.
Living in harmony with nature.
Yep.
Mm-hmm. And a rather kind of whitewashed, sorry, that is probably the wrong term, although maybe it is, present-washed view of these societies as, not all the things which would really be different about them are not really attended to in these films, like their religious beliefs, the actual role of women within them, and what actually they're treated. Because
these anachronisms keep creeping in. Because you want to sell tickets to get...
Well, we want to present them as people we can relate to.
Yeah.
We don't want to necessarily go too far into working out what it might have actually been like, particularly if it doesn't then provide a good model for our own society.
So interesting. I mean,
yes.
Michael, I do want to hear your voice, but I do want to say that's interesting in terms of...
There are people, post-colonial writers at the moment, who say we should have a worldwide alliance between oppressed groups in modern societies and oppressed groups in traditional societies, and gay people would be there within this rainbow alliance. It raises the question, how would a gay person have been treated within this American Indian village? Well, it's not even represented. We don't even... We're going to get to answer that question. So it's very easy to slant things to make an argument by not knowing the historical record or not looking too much into it.
And
and I see that as an anachronism, as a kind of...
But again, I would just say, because you're opening up some interesting questions, that we're not saying that there's anything necessarily wrong in developing a narrative that's engaged and plugged in with contemporary debates, right? So what is the role of living in harmony? Is harmony with nature something that is aspirational and so forth? What does hunting mean? And it's not necessarily wrong, but again, the anachronism there, if you're claiming this is portraying... I mean, they did have people from the Comanche Nation involved in developing this film and providing advice. Michael, what do you... You've taken your headphones off. You've given up. Michael, what do you think? I mean, again, your background being around indigenous cultures and communities from a perspective of the project you're doing. Did the anachronisms stand out to you?
Oh, yes. Look, to me, it was a little bit like taking The Simpsons and then putting it back to, when was it, 1719, and going, I wonder what Homer would be like. And to me, it's much the same thing. It's a device to make it relatable, and to take what we might think of as being the best aspects of American society today, being family values, collegiality, the ability to work as a team, courage, bravery under stress, as well as, of course, the feminist values, which are fairly important these days to the present society, and then trying to wed that with this idea of a sort of a peaceful, sustainable life in early times of a noble indigenous people. And that's great as a story.
Yes.
And misses out on so many things that, frankly, we'd rather ignore.
Because there could be a different film here. I mean, it's very difficult, I guess, to avoid the types of cliches and tropes of cinema, because this ultimately is a kind of cinematic object that has gone through various, product development or promotional development strategies, meetings, to get something that can be mainstream appealing.
It's also in a franchise.
Yeah, and that's right. It's part of a franchise, so it's got to jump through a lot of hoops. The film is successful, right? In terms of this has a very high score on Rotten Tomatoes in terms of its audience and critical reaction. For what I've seen, while the streaming companies don't release numbers, certainly the hype around it and the level of commentary around it has all been positive. So it has worked. There hasn't been much. I mean, in terms of unpacking the film and some of the commentators around it, it mainly does boil down to critiques around the portrayal of the female protagonist.
Well, can I come in there again? I mean, one person to think of who's been in the news recently, sadly died, is the actor Raquel Welch, who portrayed this prehistoric woman wearing a fur-lined bikini. And the anachronism there is that she is obviously a modern woman, nicely having showered and all sorts of deodorant and so on. She's living in a cave, and in this case we have the protagonist, who is fantastic. I would say, fantastic protagonist. She is also looks like she's, and all the Red Indians, not the Red Indians, they're called the American Indians, are looking like they've washed regularly. And they're all tall and attractive looking, like American teenagers. And when they start talking, they're talking in American. Well, I think you yourself have said they start talking in the native language, the indigenous language, and then it's a device used in the film rather than making them talk in their own language all the time. We think of the film Dancing with Wolves as another way of doing that. But what we have is. She looks a bit like an American. The expressions look a bit like expressions you would see in our society about feminist issues, particularly the young girl who's empowered by her. Like, empowered is a classic anachronism of a kind of one society's values over another's. So I'd say the whole thing. It's not just simply the plot and the way the ideas are presented, but it's the way the actors themselves are presented. It's all anachronism.
So we could unpack the film in terms of moments of anachronism.
Oh, and the hairstyle, the hair is loose hair.
Yes.
Very attractive.
And interesting.
And none of all the others are all braided, the male hair. And why is it loose hair? It's only because of the needs of the film, probably, rather than.
And.
What it was actually like, if it was like that, which it wasn't like that.
Yeah, and so one thing with cinema, of course, is suspension of disbelief. And a film can fail because you can no longer suspend your disbelief that this is just purely made-up story and you're only seeing the kind of conventions now. But you were very praising of the film. You thought it worked quite well. The anachronisms didn't get in the way of you enjoying the film.
Well, I think it works very well in raising these very issues. And there's a lot of literature which is making us think about how we live and could things have been different. Yeah. One book I particularly have enjoyed reading, which is a very difficult book with quite a tendentious, difficult argument, is David Graeber's, the anthropologist David Graeber, Graeber, last book, The Dawn of Human Civilization or something, which is basically talking about we don't necessarily need to live this way. And, if we're looking at what's happening at the moment, we're all leaping out to space through the largesse of billionaires and their creative activities. There could be another path for human beings in which we would be happier. And this path is found in the prehistoric record of people living 40,000 years ago. For what we know about them, although what we do know about them is confined, I find this quite extraordinary, not an anthropologist, to like a few burial sites. One of which shows someone with an arrow sticking out, and that's meant to show there was a war of all against all at that point. And the other one, found 5,000 years later, is one which is a dwarf who was being looked after by the tribe, and shows they had a caring collectivist ethos. And that's meant to show that there's an alternative routes we could have taken even then. But it opened it up to me to look at that book, the film Prey, which is quite unusual, I would say.
Yes. Look, and I mean, Michael, what did you think of the type of criticism that Prey might be making of contemporary society as being a kind of the wrong branch that we've taken off in civilization, and if we could only turn back time, or maybe it's not too late to rework who we are back into a hunter-gatherer society or something. Did you feel in some way this kind of romantic narrative of hunter-gatherer society in the film?
Absolutely there is. That totally buys into that fantasy. When really what I saw in the film most of all was a celebration of violence. And to me, that was the narrative of it. It's this escapist, like, violence is great. And look, I'm a feminist young woman and I can be violent too. Well done.
Yeah, and kind of video game violent. And so she develops that axe that can get thrown and
ridiculous.
Then grab
that
the
is
back.
a damning thing to say, isn't it? They think it's all about communal living and teaching this better way of life, but really it's reinforcing our own love of violence.
Well, is it a love of violence? And I think that the thing that characterizes us as a modern Enlightenment style society is that we have no longer seen the need for violence or the need to inculcate or grow our children into violence. It's simply no longer needed in the society we operate in today. It is so past tense, it's an insult.
It is interesting because in a number of moments in the film, you would kind of say, why doesn't he just run away in this scene, right? For instance, the French trappers. There's this very elaborate scene where they've trapped our two Comanche protagonists, and our French trappers, the antagonists in this scene, are kind of using them as bait, and they've got this very elaborate trap set up, and the predator, of course, comes into it, and violence ensues. But all the Westerners stand their ground very bravely, and try, even though they see all their fellow French trappers die around them very quickly. They're fine. What would you point to that as an example of this kind of?
Is that for the French nation? It's not simply making money, but they're actually.
Is it heroic? I mean, what were they? What was being demonstrated in the violence we were seeing in those scenes in terms of? I guess you're asking the symbolism of it. Does it suggest? I mean, because up until that scene, we'd been seeing these Western trappers very much as the evil hunters. That is, if we see this as one of the topics that it's talking about violence and hunting, we have three different versions of violence in this film. One is the Comanche violence, which is given often quite positive, except for one scene where the other braves try and drag heroine Naru back to the village, and that breaks out in violence with her fighting and struggling against the other braves. But overall, there's an idea of sustainability within that violence, that they're hunting and that their violence is serving a purpose for, their career advancement, I guess, within the tribe.
I would say, Craig, comparing it to the sociological research I have done, including the retirement village study, what is missing, or what is easy to miss out, is the context. Is to spend a bit of time on the context. Then you understand what the people are doing. Whereas here, we don't really know what the French were doing in this film.
Well, yeah, because
what do we imagine what they were doing?
Yeah, I mean, we see the buffalo, right, which we presume is what the French are there in that kind of history we have now of Western exploitation through colonialism of native flora and fauna.
By the way, another reference for our listeners: Ghosh, Amitai Ghosh, Ghosh, the book The Nutmeg, is a devastating portrayal of Western colonialism and its effect, and with a very, very strong message that it's a better way of life as well.
It tries.
The
Whereas
nutmeg.
I see it as merely talking about how the society we have today is just an outgrowth of the hunter-gatherer society that we once had, and they acted in similar ways. As in, to me, any hunter-gatherer society that had the power that is exhibited by, say, the Dutch in the 1600s would do very similar things because they could.
In terms of the portrayal we're seeing of the French in this film.
Well, look, in terms of the French portrayal, I think that goes a lot more to the work of Jonathan Haidt, H-A-I-D-T, which talks about groupism. And it's very interesting 5 moral pillars that he promotes, and there's a quiz you can do to find out where you stand. And to me, it's the groupism. Excuse me, I'll carry on.
Sorry.
It's the groupism between the French. The French are portrayed as being bad, right? And because they're bad, when they die, we celebrate. Yay! They're not people. They don't have families, mothers, children. They don't really suffer terribly, or if they do, that's okay because they're not part of our group. And in the same way, there's the in-group of the Comanche Nation. And it's that sort of groupism, which is also, when projected like that, I consider to be toxic as something that we're trying to teach people. There's good and there's bad, and it's bad people, they suffer, that's great.
Can I press you on that a little bit? It's the idea that the Comanche value system, as I understand it, hunter-gatherers, is you only take what you need. That is surely different to our own modern hunter-gatherer mentality.
It's a different representation of need. You see, with the hunter-gatherer societies, they were very dependent upon their environment. They didn't have the technology that we do to multiply our efforts and gain greater sustainability in our lifestyle that we choose. So for them, being so on edge, so close to, at times, starvation and privation, they have to carefully manage their environment by what they take from it and what they do to it. And this we then celebrate as being sustainability, when really it's based upon the terrible threat of death, which pretty much around any corner. So don't go saying it's noble. It's not. It's survival and nothing else.
And
it's
I guess also
Hobbesian view, really.
Pardon?
Hobbes's view of human beings from the very outset just being competing with each other and being violent towards each other, and it takes different forms.
Okay.
Yeah.
There's a reason why tribes generally number about 100 people, because that is a sustainable unit by which people can get to know each other and so on. If it increases enough, they'll split off and form another tribe. I think that's the way it works. Right? And the reason for this is, again, sheer survival, but survival in groups. And I'll come back to that thing about groups again. There's a certain sustainable number, both socially and environmentally, that's possible with certain levels of technology. And there's a reason why, once we had agriculture, we started having villages, and then we had further advances of technology, we had towns, and now we've got cities and mega cities. Like, it's sheerly the growth of our ability to leverage our effort into greater ability to survive.
Just on the very interesting, Graeber would have a different view, but it would be interesting to see what you'd say when you read it. We talk about that, but we're talking about the titles at the end of the film, which are like these kind of cave paintings. It's an anachronism because the cave paintings were much earlier in human history, different groups. They weren't these American Indians. So it's like the whole thing is playing fast and loose with our understanding of history and representation. And the soundtrack over these jokey cartoons, I found extraordinary. A tonal mistake, perhaps.
Well, look, and again, part of it is recognizing by this point the movie's changed gears from, again, this kind of coming-of-age Disney-type narrative of a hunter-gatherer society into a science fiction action film. So I think it's forgiven somewhat. Also for fans of the series, I guess what we're seeing in that final sequence with the end credits is this question of, well, what happens next to our heroes and this tribe, right? I mean, and again, it would be interesting from a more realistic perspective in terms of how a hunter-gatherer society would overcome the loss of every brave. I think there weren't any of age males left at the end of this film. It was only Naru.
You could say it's a bit like a feminist fantasy in that respect, or that's rather
it's
rather a facetious thing to say.
Because at the end of the film, you were pointing out to me afterwards that the sister, her younger sister, gives her a wink or something. The idea of sisterly brotherhood, that she has managed to break the societal conventions now. This society was functioning in a sustainable fashion, but all the male hunter-gatherers or the braves have died, and now it's her. And possibly, we could propose a kind of sequel to this film, which is a feminist fantasy of...
Yeah, let's. And look, let's avoid the reality by all means that without their braves to protect them, they would be subject to the depredations of neighbouring tribes. And they would very quickly find themselves kidnapped, killed, whatever, if they weren't useful, and taken as wives, second, third wives, whatever, of people in neighbouring tribes, because they're unable to defend themselves.
How do you know that, though? Do you just assume that's there in the studies about these? I agree with you. It's probably the case.
Yeah, that look, from my studies of the indigenous cultures of Australia, that is indeed what happens.
This is the film 10 Canoes would be an example of an attempt to portray that culture.
Well, that is an interesting point. I mean, there are other films that take this hunter-gatherer society narrative and put it into cinemas. So I'm thinking of Mel Gibson's, Apocalypto, early Aztec society, or maybe it was late Aztec society by that stage, 10 Canoes, and then at the other end you've got Dances with Wolves, kind of continuation of this noble savage narrative.
It's a great movie, Dances with Wolves. One of the things that Graeber says is that when the Europeans were kidnapped by these American Indian groups, very few of them wanted to come back to the European way of life.
This is part of Graeber's evidence that
he sees this as compelling evidence that they were superior.
What was the John Ford movie that also had this?
Or could it just be that after a few years of living with them, they had formed relations and basically relational attachments, so that they now had, wives or husbands or children. So why would they want to leave? It's not like they can then just uproot this family system they have and they care about now.
Well, it's a typical kind of argument that he makes. It is very slippery.
And again, so we're critiquing, Prey as a part of an extension, a kind of romanticization of...
Yeah, look, I think the bottom line is that Prey is entertainment. And it's entertainment designed to sell eyes on the screen and bums on seats. And it'll do that, in this case, using the device of feminism, violence, harking back to the noble savage indigenous society and a celebration of things Indian, whilst having nice, relatable baddies. Right?
Yes.
And don't we love it? It's nice and simple. It's...
I'd like more films like that.
Yeah, look, I mean, I consider myself quite a kind of intelligence viewer of cinema, but I do like the unsettled vibe I felt when we pointed out just how clearly this celebrates violence. And again, I'm not someone that feels there's a media effect concern in terms of I'm simply going to watch a violent film and become violent myself. But nevertheless, it is interesting in terms of many reviewers... there's a kind of academic satisfaction that can come about by simply breaking down a topic and talking about the categories in which the topic's forming. So the three models of hunting that we see in this film, right, they're each value propositions. And it kind of forgives the violence in a way. Well, here we have these three violence, but it's on a scale of good to bad, right?
Makes me think whether anyone has written an essay on science fiction and violence as a vehicle for... acceptable violence, fantasy violence.
Yes.
And I think the important word there is
other
acceptable. Yeah.
Of course, there are other genres as well. I mean, there's the Western genre, or the crime genre.
And I'd like to compare this to my research in alcohol control. And that is that something like the top 10% of people in Australia consume 50% of the alcohol.
So the top 10% of people...
Of drinkers
consume 50%. So it's a bit like the data around gambling I've come across.
Yep. And
a very small percentage, but they are at the extreme of overconsumption of that product.
Yep. And I think that people often go, well, look, I can have a drink and I can control myself, and why should I be restricted in what I can do for the sake of these people who can't control themselves? Which is great if we can consider can somehow snap our fingers and they can control themselves. No, they can't. And the same way, we could say the same thing about violence. I enjoy a good violent movie. It gets me sweating. I get a bit smelly. I have to wash my armpits afterwards. Through the excitement, which I experience peripherally, from the safety of my seat. But at the same time, there are people who are a little bit more on edge, who are a bit of the outliers, who aren't going to take that well. And to use an extreme example, I know and have experienced a young autistic child who, through whatever reason, nevertheless loved Tom and Jerry. Everybody remembers Tom and Jerry, the slapstick violence, ultra-violence of Tom and Jerry. And what would he do? He would go around chasing other children, seeking to commit acts of violence upon them. And why? He didn't have that enculturation of being a peaceful, sharing, calm, kind person to balance against these slapstick violence that he sees. And in the same way, I think that this violence we see that's being promoted here is potentially poisonous.
Promoted...
Not just potentially, actually. It's poisonous.
But again, I mean, even you acknowledge the kind of complex web of influences that can be acted upon any individual. I imagine you're not saying if we simply remove cinema from the equation...
It's like saying if an alien being arrived on a spaceship and sampled our TV and was watching Tom and Jerry, he would see that we were a very violent culture at its root. Well, we're not.
Yes.
No.
And I think if we don't want violence in our culture, how about we don't promote it? Is that too much of like a light bulb moment?
Well, what I find interesting here, though, is that, again, most of the discussion of this film has been about, I think in terms of online, more of a discussion of the feminist narrative that's there rather than the violent narrative there, in terms of, some people saying it's completely unbelievable having this, kind of character who happens to be female overcoming this strong predator that they couldn't believe it. Yeah. Others saying, the original film was better.
The very first scene where someone's thrown the axe against a tree, we immediately said, well, that's just unbelievable, and it certainly wasn't her throwing it because the film cut to show that someone else had thrown it. You need to be super strong to have the axe embedded in a tree like that. Never mind whether there's a rope attached to it or not. So it was a fantasy from the beginning.
And I think at certain times, Michael, your concerns around violence would have resonated more strongly as the dominant reading of where cinema is problematic in terms of, the entire what was it, the Hays Code that was introduced into cinema to attempt to address concerns of overly violent material. Yet it is interesting, I think, now that the kind of concern around a cinema prey is more around gender issues than violent issues. And by that, I'm not diminishing the significance of the violent issues, but it's. I mean, one could say it's because we've desensitized
a very
ourselves.
male view of feminism, in my opinion. And it is the male view being, wow, if you're feminist enough, you can be violent like us to that same degree with the same degree of effectiveness.
But you're trapped in the conventions of the genre, I think, at this point. I mean,
And
for
of male
a film
thinking.
like
You can be
Craig.
pretty sure this wasn't written by women,
Yeah.
nor promoted by women, which is a completely different paradigm. I mean, sure enough, yes, women can be violent too, and the recent liberation of women shows that yes, they can drink like men, they can go to jail like men.
Yeah.
Yep.
And the
Great.
problem,
So
and the problem
we're
with
left
this is
with
that
the difficult question: what would a truly feminist film look like?
well, we're stuck. We're three
Certainly
men.
We're travelling quite far now from the original.
Well, yeah, look, but we're also, I mean, in terms of what you were talking before we went on air about also recognizing the limitations and I guess the groundedness of our perspective and our expertise in this, we are three men
Yes.
that are arriving at this point of discussing representations of female characters in cinema as three men, right? So there's an inherent limitation in terms of, the I guess the diversity of
Her
opinion we can
mother
bring in.
in the film is a different point of view. She seems to enjoy being in the kitchen all the time.
Yeah,
and doing the embroidery.
And you could say she's conforming quite nicely to the antagonist.
She's a happy person.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think there's an excellent example of what it's like, the different paradigm between men and women is an example that Robert Sapolsky gave, who's a neuroprimatologist. And he talked about a tribe of gorillas. And the alpha male gorillas who were more adventurous, they went off and they betook themselves of a garbage dump of humans. They were poisoned and diseased and died, leaving the beta males, let's say. And what happens amongst the male gorillas is they're quite hierarchical. And it's found that if a higher up on the scale alpha male beats up on the one, say, next lowest down, then the stress levels of that gorilla rises. And then what it will do is go and beat up on one lower down than itself. And sure enough, the stress levels in the blood decrease. Isn't that great? Right? And this can go all the way down, of course, to the female gorillas. And so the female gorillas get beaten up on, and that relieves the stress of the other male gorillas. And everybody's happy except no one's happy. Maybe the one directly on top wears a lot of responsibility. So here's the clincher. And that is that women, the female gorillas, can groom the male gorillas. And that too will reduce the stress levels in the blood. And if they're allowed to, they will perform that function. And then all the gorillas are happier, including, of course, the females who are no longer being beaten up on, but seeing as a valued addition to the male's life.
See, I see that evidence as strong or weak as finding a skeleton in a burial mound with an arrow sticking in or not. There is no evidence for this. This is a philosophy exercise, really, and it was always thus from Rousseau and Noble Sandwich to Hobbes, the war against all. Well, you've got to pick your position and argue for it. But at the same time, here it is in a film, Prey, a popular film. It's fascinating.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, that is drawing heavily upon potentially normalized narratives on one hand. And I mean, what's been so fun about this journey of the last hour is trying to make explicit some of the concepts that people would just normalize as matter of fact or common sense, and instead try and push what are the assumptions here within this scene or this moment, and beginning from the point of anachronism on.
Well, and let's look at perhaps the motivations of the alien predator. Maybe the alien predator is off big game hunting to prove himself because, as I think you mentioned, Craig, maybe he's like just a dentist who's off big game hunting, or a businessman who's never hunted before. And it's like, okay, let's go hunt some natives on a planet. Great. Right. But why is he doing it? For not only that, but also maybe stress relief. So maybe what might happen is that he would just end up being groomed by the local populace, and they would just have this nice time.
What an interesting idea.
And maybe that's a feminine perspective of winning over the savage beast and allowing the savage beast to be, dare I say, sort of socialized into being a less violent member of the world or society.
It's a view.
Well, yeah, look, and while I think, the concept's problematic, nevertheless, I do like the idea of a different pitch for the script where instead of Nauru female Comanche character simply progressing into a violent, as you would see it, alpha, beta,
I thought it was
male,
like they the
it's to
predators
groom
have
the
evolved.
predator.
They now live in a
Well, isn't
very...
that Beauty and the Beast, though? Isn't that the narrative of Beauty and the Beast? where
Except,
Beauty
of course,
tries
that the
to
beast
groom
was always
the Beast?
good-hearted, and maybe that's the case. I see examples of that.
I saw it that the predator comes from a violent civilization which has become peaceful, but they've lost touch with their roots, and these ritual hunts are ways of getting back in touch with their original violence, but in a ritualistic way.
And that is such almost
have no
those kind
evidence
of
for
like alpha male dentist society. Oh, sorry, I shouldn't be little. I mean, the reason I'm saying dentist is simply it was proposed by a fan
It's a
theory.
rollerball. It's a rollerball type idea.
Yeah. Well, yeah, it's interesting because there is that discourse that some people have of, getting back into a paleotonic diet and finding your inner kind of caveman, having your kind of cave experience. That seems to be about this predator narrative. But yeah, maybe it's a society that needs to violence up. But again, we're returning to the narrative of violence,
And
which
needs
is
to violence up. Why? What purpose does it actually serve?
and I do enjoy the theory underpinning the critique around an alternative model of a grooming-based society or a grooming intervention into a spiral of violence, that instead of a spiral of violence, if you can intersect... And I imagine these research papers are putting this forward, that in their observations of primitive or of chimpanzee or ape society seems to reveal that female chimpanzees or apes would groom to de-escalate situations in a non-violent manner. Therefore, yes, could there have been in prey, if similarly it conforms to a convention of violence, begetting more violence, could that be intersected with the grooming behavior, a non-violent grooming behavior?
I always feel at this point in the conversation that there will be someone who's already written a learned paper on these issues, and that we are simply just catching up to the beginning of that conversation.
Yeah. No,
I don't know. I may be wrong.
Well, yeah, I mean, I
wouldn't be
feel
about
that
prey,
I
it would
feel
be about
haunted by
violence in cinema. It would be about.
I feel haunted by very research which would have unpacked stereotypes of heteronormative patriarchal female behavior. Within this, I'm thinking Beauty and the Beast and the critique of Beauty and the Beast as having a subtext around normalizing domestic abuse. That the female character puts up with the abuse she suffers to tame the wild heart of this abusive male character, and then, of course, does that and.
I don't see that works with prey at all, though.
Well,
She kills him in the end.
the alternative
She
narrative
comes
for
back with
prey
his
would be
head.
that she tries to groom the predator, that she tries to soothe the savage heart of the predator.
She doesn't.
To reveal his.
But do you notice,
heart.
though, that it almost edges into that in the movie, that they're forming some sort of a relationship almost simply on the basis of the fact that the predator doesn't kill her straight away.
Yeah.
And so there's this continuing relationship of her not being killed. And maybe he gets to have some sort of a, maybe I don't want to kill this one sort of
No, I thought
idea.
it was a code that you
Pocahontas?
cannot kill something much weaker than yourself, or something.
Yeah,
like
well, there's a sense of honor that certainly the alternative males of the French trappers lack, right? That the French, the violence and hunting performed by the French male trackers is evil, inherently evil, because it's wasteful, it's greed-based, and they're, as Michael was pointing out, we root for their death. We are satisfied and happy at their death, and they deserve their punishment because they're portrayed as bad. Yet, I think the predator is, they're evil. I think they're morally judged evil, whereas the predator is seen as simply bad, right? He's the antagonist in a way. Well, is he? Yeah. There's something there to think about. But I realize we're kind of at the hour. Somehow we've arrived with 50 minutes of discussion of this.
How do we
that.
manage
Well,
that?
Well, your point's very good.
Yeah, I'd like to thank Michael and Max again for coming on. Thank you so much.
Pleasure.
If people want to find out more about their research, where can they go to find out more about what you're doing? You mentioned a government website. I'll put it on the Facebook page.
Ahuri, Ahuri.
Michael,
Yeah,
anything
look,
if people want to know more about what you're doing?
My only thing has been a thing on prohibition on YouTube.
Really?
Yes.
Okay, well, you can send me a link. I'll put it on my... It'll escalate the views of that Sky
And
High.
yeah, and if anybody has information, as Max was talking about, on what we've been talking about, and can enlighten us further, by all means,
Yes, you can reach out.
contact.
You can reach out to me at Media Mothership via Facebook or YouTube. The details are all up there, so just search for Media Mothership on Facebook, YouTube, or Instagram. Coming up next, we have Adrian with You Can't Sit Down, playing some great tunes from the 60s. So if people have found this a little bit too stressful, you can chill out now with some great tunes by Adrian. Thanks again. This is Edge Radio 99.3 FM.